Okay, so it's part 2 of our ASP.NET authentication lesson. Just want to spend about 5 minutes talking about SSL certificates and how and why we want to use SSL certificates. What is an SSL certificate and why is it important and becoming more important? Anybody used one before? Alex?
It prevents the man-in-the-middle attacks.
Okay, yeah. Can you explain a bit more how that works?
Basically, if you're using a public network like here in Georgian, and I think Georgian has a strangely configured network, but if you're using like a home network and someone is attached to your home network, they can basically catch every traffic that you're doing and use SSL stripper to basically get rid of in the old versions, if you're using Internet Explorer 8, they can basically take all the data that you're sending to the website and the website is sending to you. So they can steal your passwords, your logins, everything.
Right, okay. By default, all traffic sent over HTTP is sent in plain text. When a user fills out a form and presses submit, anything they put in that form, which could include something like a credit card number, it gets sent from their browser to the web server in plain text. Any data we display, let's say a bank account balance from your bank, it comes in plain text by default. That's how HTTP works. What an SSL certificate does is it encrypts the content that's transferred between a web server and an HTTP-enabled device. So a browser, a phone, a tablet, anything. Okay? So you can see, so for example, on this site, how can you tell? You can actually see that this site is secured with an SSL certificate. How can you tell, Raj?
It says HTTPS.
Yep. So when we see HTTPS, that means there is a valid SSL certificate running on this domain. Okay? And part of our responsibility as developers is setting up, installing, configuring, and renewing. Our customers are not going to do this. You have to do this. It's actually on a to-do list of mine. I have a few customer certificates I have to renew. And one of the other responsibilities we have is, what if I try to go to this page and I take out the S? Notice if I hit enter, it comes right back with the S. So it's not enough to install the certificate. We also have to add code in the website. So if someone tries to go to the HTTP version, the unencrypted version, they get redirected to the HTTPS version. Blackboard works the same. If I try and take out the S, it will redirect me back to the secure version. And we can see, we can actually inspect the certificate on any HTTPS enabled site. So we can actually read, we can see when the certificate expires, you can see what hashing algorithm was included in it. So it used to be that we only needed this for websites where there was something really important, like we were asking for credit cards, or we were handling any sensitive information, any site where people were logging in. We want to use HTTPS so their passwords are encrypted as they're sent over the internet. This has become more important than ever. Why? Because of Google. Because Google announced not too long ago that SSL is a factor in your Google ranking. So if you have, unless you have read-only pages, if you have any forms at all, Google is going to start to flag them if you have even a simple contact form and there's no SSL. Users are going to start getting security warnings, which is going to do what? It's going to scare them away from using the sites you've built. So pretty much, so this is what it's going to look, this is what it looks like in Chrome now. It used to look like this, and as of 2017, it'll now say, any domain, it'll say not secure at the top if there's no SSL certificate. So that's going to scare people away. So eventually it's going to say this with a big red alert. So there are different kinds of SSL certificates. This link, which I've put up, actually tells you how to get a free one. I've also found you can get them very inexpensively here. So Namecheap probably has, now there's different levels of SSL certificates. that have different levels of encryption. But you can get a cheap one for $11.57 Canadian per year. When I started in the business, the cheapest one you could get was $300 a year. So they've come down in price, but you get different options. So for example, here's a multi-domain certificate. So there's different levels of warranty and different levels of encryption you can get. So up to, with these guys, they're about the cheapest ones. Typically you buy them for a year or 2 years, and the max 3, you have to renew them. They're not transferable though. So if you host a website on this server and you buy an SSL certificate and you decide, I don't like that host, I want to move to another host, guess what? You have to buy and install a new SSL certificate. Okay. So we want our music store to have an SSL certificate, and we want to force it so that these URLs are always secure. Right? We've got no certificate here. So we want it to run under HTTPS all the time. So in Visual Studio, there's a simple way we can set this up. First thing is if we go up to the top and click on our music store project, not the solution, but our music store project, click on that. And if I right click, actually, sorry, I want to just turn on my properties sheet. I'll click view and property window. Window back up here, which I closed. So notice down here, it says SSL enabled is false. So by default, when we create a project in Visual Studio, SSL is not running. If I want to change that, I'll just change false to true. So now we have 2 versions of our music store. The unencrypted version runs at HTTP with a specific port, but the SSL version runs with HTTPS on a different port. So if I just save that change, I can now grab and copy my secure URL, and we can try it out. The site will work exactly the same, except our browser is going to tell us that it's secure. So I'll just paste into a new window. I may have to build before this works. No, I don't even have to. So now we have a secure version running with HTTPS, and we can even view. Actually, it doesn't show us, but it is marked as secure.
Can you do it again?
Sure. So click your project. If you don't see this little window here that says properties, click the view menu, and near the bottom is properties window. I think it's the 3rd item from the bottom. That will open the little bottom in the right-hand corner of my screen. In there, in the SSL enabled property, change it from false to true. And Visual Studio will automatically generate an HTTPS URL, which you can then copy and paste into your browser, and we now have a secured version. But we still have 2 versions. We have a secure version running, but the non-secure version also still works. Right? Both of these versions are working now. I can browse around, go to the same page, but my HTTP version is still working. So we want to do make 2 more changes. The first one is we want to say whenever we start the project, right now it loads the home page, it loads this page. That's our startup page. We want to change the properties of the project so our startup page, instead of this version, it loads the HTTPS version. So here's how we can change that. Again, copy the SSL URL. So just highlight it in the properties sheet and copy it. And right-click on our project and choose properties. And it's going to open a bigger property sheet in the main window. Again, just right-click your project and choose properties. It should be the last option in this little pop-up menu. So we get this screen, which has all kinds of different options and settings for our web project. If we go to web, So click web here. Here's the project URL. So this is what Visual Studio is going to load every time we start it up. So it's loading the HTTP version. I'm going to delete that and paste in the HTTPS version. So now by default, every time I start my project, it's going to load the encrypted version. And then you can just hit save on your toolbar, or hit Control S. Now our project's already running, so we won't really see any change yet. If I were to close the project and restart it, I'll do that with mine. You don't have to do it with yours. I'll just close my solution now, which takes it offline, right? It's all offline. If I refresh, it'll say the server's down because I've shut my project. If I open it back up and start it without debugging, it should now load. So I'll just start without debugging again. And this time it should now load my HTTPS version from now on. Oh, okay. Well, Firefox gives me this because it's not a signed certificate. It says it's self-signed, meaning you created your own SSL certificate. It's not from a registered certificate authority. That's okay. It's just running locally. So in Firefox, I'll just add an exception here and try it in Chrome. And my HTTPS version should be running. So now the startup is going to be our HTTPS version. There's one more thing we need to do because somebody could still go to the unsecured version. If I go back to my project and take my original URL without HTTPS, if I copy this, it still works. Oh, I still have the two versions up and running. We want to modify this. We only want the HTTPS version to work. We don't want the HTTP version running anymore.
Do we have to restart Visual Studio?
Shouldn't have to.
Okay.
I just did it to show you what changing the startup URL would do.
Okay.
So we want to add one line of code that will deal with these kinds of issues. If a user tries taking out the S, we want it to force them back to the secured version. So all we need to do is add one line of code, and this will work for any page in the site. It'll apply globally. So inside our project, we haven't really worked in here. We have this folder here called app start. Bunch of files, bunch of things that fire when our application first gets started. So we're going to go into this second file here called filter config. And in here, we're going to add a line of code that will force, if the user tries to go here without the HTTPS, it will force them back to the same page with HTTPS. So we're going to add a filter. We are going to require the HTTPS attribute. That's it. So this is built into the .NET framework. All requests must use HTTPS. So if we build now, the HTTP version is no longer going to work. If any request comes in and it's not using HTTPS, it's going to redirect the user or fail. So again, that was inside of app start, inside of filter config in this existing register global filters method. So once we build, our HTTP version should be dead. So my HTTP secured version, it tries to redirect now to a secured version. It doesn't have the port number, but we've in effect disabled any unauthenticated or unencrypted HTTP requests. So this is important and going to get more important, whether we're doing ASP.NET or anything else. Unless your site is just HTML and CSS, it should now, in 2017, have an SSL certificate, which your customers should pay for, but you're going to have to set up and manage for them. And actually, if we deploy this to Azure later, Azure already has an SSL certificate, so this code will work. The forcing of HTTPS is going to work. In fact, maybe I'll do that right now. I'll just upload what we've done so far to GitHub. We added local auth and HTTPS. You don't have to do this now with yours. You can if you want. So I'm going to push this to GitHub. Everything we've done so far. So now our code is requiring HTTPS. Because Azure has a certificate, we can run it under HTTPS. Oh, I don't think it's deployed my changes to Azure yet, because my store manager link is still showing up. Yeah, it's not showing my changes yet. So I'll manually pull it from GitHub now. Yeah, it's still showing from our last class. So I'll just give that a second to run. And if it works, we should no longer be able to use HTTP. It should force us all requests to use HTTPS. All right, well, I may have to come back to that later. I'll let that run. So the last thing we want to do is we also want to enable users to be able to log in with some of those providers. We'll maybe start with Google, but once we do one, enabling the other providers is basically the same exact process. Now, this is sort of based on, I gave you a link here. We're sort of following along this tutorial from Microsoft, creating an MVC5 app with those. So I've sort of adapted what they've done into our music store, but the link is here, so you have this as a reference as well if you want it. I guess I'll just let that go for now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go to the Google Developer Console. I've given you the link here on Blackboard. You do need a Google account for this. Okay, so they force you to have an account if they're going to if you want to add the ability to log in with a Google account to your website, you have to have a Google account. Okay. So in Blackboard, inside of week 7, go down and you can grab that link, console.developers.com. I'll copy that link. I'll go back to Chrome because I'm already logged in. So it will take you here. You get a certain number of projects for free. So I'll call this COMP2084 Music Store. You can call yours anything you like. No, don't email me. And yes, I agree to the terms of service. And then just click Create. So what this allows us to do is use any one of the APIs that Google makes available. So any of the libraries, we can add them into integrate them into our website if we want. So I'll create the project. Now it's asking me to select a project at the top here. I have all these other ones. You guys won't have them yet. It's still creating this. Come on, Google, you can do it. As everyone else is spinning, or can you can you select your project? I may have to try that again, since it doesn't seem to work. Okay, we'll try one more time. Is anybody able to create a project, or is your screen spinning like mine? Oh, okay, there. Finally gave me a project. So once your project is set up, you should get this screen. They just changed it. So what we want under the Getting Started is to enable an API. So I'm going to click under Getting Started, this link. Enable APIs and get credential-like keys. So it says these are the popular ones, you know, add Gmail or Google Drive or Maps to your application. We don't want any of these. I'm going to click on View All. What we want, if we scroll down, is we want the Google Plus API. That includes Google Login. So just click on Google Plus API. And click Enable. So it's enabled now, but it says in order for you to use it, we need to create credentials. So click that blue Create Credentials button. So we're creating a Google Plus API. We're calling it, we can just say from a web server. We're accessing user data because we want other people to be able to use their Google username and password to log into the music store. So we don't need application data, we want user data. And we have to click this "What credentials do I need" button. We already know what credentials we need, but we'll just click it. So now it says create a client ID. So we can, it just defaults to web client 1. That's fine. We can leave it. Actually, sorry, we should change this because this will be the title that appears in the little pop-up window when a user clicks login with Google. So we'll call this MVC Music Store. Now this is important. The redirect URI. So after someone logs in with Google, Google needs to know what are the pages to send the user back to. So we want to add 2 different URLs here. We want to add our local host version so we can test it with Visual Studio. And I also want to add my Azure version so when I deploy it to Azure, it will redirect them back to my Azure site. So here's what goes in here. We need to grab the URL of our local site with HTTPS. So grab that with the port number and copy it. Paste it in here. And on the end of it, we need sign-in/Google. Sorry, sign-in-Google. That's the name of the URL. That the Google library that comes with ASP.NET, it will redirect us back to that address if the user has signed in. And then I'll click Create Client ID. I'm also going to put in my Azure URL. You don't have to do this, but it won't work on Azure otherwise. So I'm going to grab my Azure URL and I'm going to add that one as well, again with /sign-in. Google. So both of these URLs are valid now for this application. I can run it locally and sign in with Google, or I can run it on Azure and sign in with Google. So I'll click to create again. And you have to click one more time, strangely. And then it brings up this, the OAuth consent screen. So it'll have the email address of your Google account and the product name, again, I'll call it MVC Music Store. If you want, you can add a logo, you can add a homepage privacy policy. So you can customize the little login with Google pop-up window that users will get. I'm going to leave the rest of this stuff blank. It's all optional. I'll just put in a descriptive name. And I'll click Continue. And now we'll come back to this part because we'll need to get our credentials from Google. We'll have to add them into Visual Studio. in a minute. I'll just say I'll do this later. Okay. So we're going to need this ID, and then there's also a secret key, and we're going to need both of those in our Visual Studio Code that will connect our website to this little Google app we're creating. So enabling this stuff in Visual Studio is pretty easy. We've already opened up this filter config. In here, in app start, there's another file here called startup.auth. Let's open that one up. There's a bunch of code in here. And if we scroll down to line 61, we can just uncomment the Google section and then add in the credentials from the Google portal. So uncomment lines 61 through 65. And now we're going to grab that Google ID, and then we'll have to grab the secret. So I'll go back, grab my client ID and copy it. And I'll paste it inside of the quotations for client ID. This long string that ends in apps.googleusercontent.com. That's the first part. Now it's also asking for a client secret. We haven't seen that yet. And notice, if you look at Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, they all work the same way. You get two credentials, an ID and a secret. So enabling those other ones is almost the exact same as enabling Google. Now, where do we get that secret? If we just click on our music store here, there's the ID, there's the secret. So the secret value is shorter. Just copy that. So again, I just clicked on the name of my application here. Grab the secret. Paste it in. Now, this is not really the best place to store these values. These kind of values, we really don't want them hard-coded into our C# and included in our DLL. These should probably go in our web.config file along with our database connection. We'll put it in here first and we'll try it out. Then we're going to move these values out, stick them in our web.config, and we'll want to read them out of that file instead. So if we have to change them, we can just change the config file rather than recompiling our DLL. So let's build. And now I want to open up, I'm not going to use this browser here because I'm already logged into my Google account here. So I'm going to open up an incognito window, so I'm not logged into my Google account here. I'll copy my HTTPS local URL. I'm not logged into the music store, and I'm not logged into Google in this browser. I'm totally anonymous. It's a private window. And now when I click on login, automatically we have a Google button added by ASP.NET Identity. Right? We didn't have to do anything. All we had to do was uncomment those 4 lines. And it knows. So now when we try to log in with Google, it checks if we're signed in. Notice here's where our little name shows up. Again, as like I said, you can customize this by adding links, adding a logo to your site and all that. We didn't do that. So now if I log in with a valid Google account, so Google has authenticated me. It's passed my Google username. But now ASP.NET Identity wants to create an account in my SQL server with that email address. So if I just click register, I'm now signed in with my Google account. If we look in the database at my list of users, it's now added me. Notice it doesn't have the password because the authentication is done by Google instead of locally and through my database. So they've made this super easy. The only other thing we really should do with this, as I mentioned, is this probably isn't the best place for those values. Those should probably go in our web.config file instead, and we should read those two values out of our web.config. So we can do that. We'll only take a minute, and then we'll basically stop for the day. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up my web.config, which is right here. Start. And in here, we have this section called App Settings. That allows us to create any kind of global settings or variables that are visible through the whole site. Well, I'll add just a section in here. We'll add our Google credentials here, and eventually we'll add our Facebook and Microsoft credentials as well. So we're going to add a key called Google Client ID. We'll add a second key called Google Client Secret. Then we'll cut and paste those values in here. So I'm going to take my secret and remove it, put it in there instead. I'll do the same with my ID. Take it out. And put it here. Now, if we try this right now, our Google Auth is no longer going to work. So what we need to do is we need to tell this file, hey, those credentials you're looking for, they're in web.config. So up here, add a reference so we can read keys. So we're going to use the system.configuration library. This allows this file to read values out of web.config. So it's gray right now because it says, well, this isn't necessary. We're not using this library. We're linking to it, but not using it. Well, we're going to change that. So in here, we can use this configuration manager class . This code says get the value called Google Client ID from web.config. And then we'll do the same for the client secret. So I'll copy that and change ID secret. We won't see any difference in how this works. It's going to work the exact same way, but this is better practice for storing those kinds of values. We don't typically want to store those things in our application code. That's what the config file is for. So if we build, we should still be able to log out and log in with a Google account. In this browser, I'm already logged into Google. So I should just be able to click login and hit Google, and I won't even see the pop-up. I'm already logged in with Google. So if I do this, I won't even see my little login with Google box. Just says, okay, do you want to continue? You're already signed in. Google already knows who I am. Yep. And I'm logged back in with my Google account. So there's no practical difference to the end user, whether we put those credentials in this file directly or put them in our configuration file. It works the same way. Now, I was going to give you a lab to enable your Microsoft login, and it's the same. As soon as I uncomment this on our login page, we get a Microsoft button that then links to them, will give us a little Microsoft pop-up. And I'm going to do this, want to do the same with Facebook. So I was going to give you the lab and ask you to have Microsoft done for next week. I think what we'll do at the start of class next week, we will do the Facebook one together, and then you can have an extra week to do the Microsoft one. Okay? So you don't have to do the Microsoft login this week. We'll go through the whole process again, but it's pretty much the same. So next week, we're going to go to the Facebook developer portal, create an API, put in the URLs of where to redirect to, grab the keys and stick them in here and uncomment this section. And then for your lab, you'll have to do the same thing with Microsoft. Ah, okay. In order to read those values out of web.config, it can't read them. We need to use that library. That library lets us read anything out of this app settings. Without it, so if I take that out, okay, that's interesting. I didn't expect that result. Maybe we don't need that reference. Let me try it. I thought we did. Seems like it's working without it. Who knew? I'll try it one more time. It will still work. I'll show you why I put it in there. It does still work. I'll show you why I put it in. I neglected this part. So it still works, but we have to type this whole long thing. By making the reference, so if I undo that, put it back, we can save some of the typing here. By making the reference, we can just do it this way, which is shorter because we're going to have to repeat it for Facebook and for Microsoft. So if we don't make the reference, we need to prefix all of those with system.configuration, and it's long enough as it is. So by referencing the library, we can just use a shortcut. Functionally, it's the same. It will be in a minute. Actually, I'll just see whether it ever deployed to Azure properly. Doesn't look like it. I'm not sure what's happening there. I don't know why it's not deploying. All right. So I will put everything we did today on GitHub. We'll also want to touch on this a bit next week. We'll do that. So the start of class, so we will do a Facebook login together. Your lab you can take home after next week's class to do the Microsoft login. It really won't take very long. You know how long did it take us? We did Google in about 15 minutes. That's about how long it will take to do the enable Microsoft login. You create an account on the developer portal, you generate the keys, you uncomment and plunk the keys in, Microsoft login works. So we're going to do that. And then what we want to do is with our store, we want to add the shopping cart. So when the user goes to store, they can view product details, they can add to cart, and we want to build a cart page where they can remove items, get the total of their cart. And we'll use Ajax, so we'll enable those updates without a full page refresh. We'll do all that next week, and then the week in 2 weeks, we'll add a checkout. We won't worry about payment, but we can actually check out and save the user's order to our SQL Server database. And then that'll basically be it for features we're adding to the music store. The week after, we'll look at how do we add unit testing into this. The other thing I'm going to do next week, I will actually give you assignment 2 next week. Because the first part of assignment 2 is basically adding authentication to your assignment 1. So I'll give it to you next week so you can start whenever you want. You can start it as early as next week. That's fine. You can, if you want, yeah, if you want to go ahead and if you figure the link for doing the Microsoft part, it's right here. So you can just follow the Microsoft developer link. Part of the reason we had to enable HTTPS, the Google and Facebook APIs will work if your site is HTTP or HTTPS. Microsoft's won't. When you put in the callback URL, if there's not an HTTPS, Microsoft won't let you save it. So we had to enable HTTPS for the Microsoft login to work. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and do it, the lab is on Blackboard. If you want to do it before next week, it's open now. You can do it anytime. I'll change the due date for lab 2, so it won't be due for 2 weeks. So it's not due next week. It's due the Monday. Whoops, it's due the Monday after, on the 4th. That's fine. If you want to go ahead and take a stab at it, go ahead. Okay. I'll put my stuff on GitHub. You guys are free to go. If you still do not have access to Azure, please send me an email and let me know, because you need to be able to host your assignment 2 somewhere.